Good afternoon, and welcome to the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council's program with guest speaker Dr. Eric Vázquez. Thanks to Dr. Vázquez and to everyone who has joined us in person and online today. I am Brett Cloyd, member of the ICFRC's board and host for today's program. We would like to acknowledge and thank our annual donors, sponsors, and partners for their support. The Iowa Arts Council through the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, Humanities Iowa and the National Endowment for the Humanities, the University of Iowa's International Programs, Honors Program, Public Policy Center, and Center for Human Rights, the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, Midwest One Bank, City Channel 4 for providing online access to all of ICFRC's programs, along with the UI Library Archives. ICFRC has adopted the Native American Land Acknowledgement prepared for the City of Iowa City's Ad Hoc Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Human Rights Commission. We recognize that our home community of Iowa City now occupies the homelands of Native American nations to whom we owe our commitment and dedication. The full text of our acknowledgement is on our website at icfrc.org. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eric Vázquez, who will speak about the innovator's dilemma, Bitcoin in El Salvador. Following his presentation, we will have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. Eric Vázquez is an assistant professor in American Studies and Latino Studies at the University of Iowa. His scholarship emphasizes the cultural, political, military, and economic bonds that link populations and institutions in the United States to Central America. His current book project, States of Defeat, U.S. Imaginaries of Central American Revolution, explores how thwarted ambitions for revolution in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala give rise to ambivalent, outraged, cynical, and mournful effects for novelists, intellectuals, immigrants, and military technocrats living in the United States. Dr. Vázquez received a dissertation writing fellowship from the Ford Foundation and received his PhD in Literary and Cultural Studies from Carnegie Mellon University in 2015. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vázquez to ICFRC today.
If everyone's okay, I'm going to take off my mask just to... It's clear I'm a pretty good projector, but I'm going to... pull the slides back a moment here. Can everyone hear me? We good? Okay. So I've lifted the title of this talk in part from a book about sort of like disruptive technology. And that was, to a degree, an accident, but I think it sort of is an interesting overlap here. Some of the important discourse, some of the discourse that seems most pressing to people who are tech innovators tends to circulate around words like disruptive, even though maybe the disruption is like an app or something. So for those of you who are maybe not unfamiliar with like the iconography of Bitcoin, this is Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, and he's sort of illuminated his eyes in his sort of profile photo as an indication that he is down for Bitcoin, that he's excited about its possibilities. And I'm going to start with this tweet that he issued on February 28th of this year. The tweet announces the intrinsic value of Bitcoin is now on display for the whole world to see. Such an announcement would not seem out of character for either Bukele, an avowed Bitcoin booster in both Spanish and English language venues, nor would it seem to depart from the script of other Bitcoin proponents, who regularly prophesize the demise of traditional fiat currencies by virtual cryptographic monies. What's more interesting to consider is how Bukele's tweet coincided with revelations that Vladimir Putin and the Russian government could evade economic sanctions imposed as a consequence of their invasion of Ukraine through the use of cryptocurrency exchanges. Bitcoin is a form of cryptocurrency, as some of you may know. As with previous sanctions imposed over the 2014 invasion and occupation of Crimea, to quote some New York Times reporters who note Russian entities are preparing to blunt some of the worst effects of these sanctions by making deals with anyone around the world willing to work with them, experts said. And they said those entities can then use digital currencies to bypass the control points that governments rely on, mainly transfers of money by banks, to block deal execution, end quote. Although President Bukele has a reputation for both innovative policy and impetuous decision-making, what might make it so that he would want to remark on matters far outside his sphere of regional influence? Why might it matter that he do so? Moreover, why might a democratically elected leader want to draw parallels between, Moreover, why might a democratically elected leader want to draw parallels between Russia's bid for boundless imperial sovereignty and Bitcoin's political and economic effects, as this tweet seems to suggest? These questions point to some of the key concerns regarding the president's 2021 implementation of Bitcoin in Salvador as legal tender, which I hope to address today. So before I dig in, I just want to tell you a few things here that I'm not going to do in this talk, and that I don't have the skill set to do. I'm not a computer scientist, so I can't really comment on the sort of algorithmic robustness of blockchain technologies that undergird Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. I'm also not a financial planner, so I can't advise you personally on cryptocurrency for future values or how it might fit into your retirement portfolio. I'm also not a traditional economist, so I'm not going to break into the formulas that assess Bitcoin's risk profile in the future. And so just to briefly point out here, because sometimes geography education in the United States is lacking, I just thought I'd point to where El Salvador is on a map. So here we see the southern border of Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras. Those three nations are now called the sort of Northern Triangle, in part because a good deal of Central American migrants, a good deal of migrants at our southern border come from those nations. Okay. So what I do is I'm going to try to tackle this problem differently than, let's say, financial analysts or computer scientists. And what I do when I research is I kind of look for context, right? I try to offer historical, social, cultural, and political economic contexts. I try to bring relevant frameworks to bear on the case study that I'm examining here, Bitcoin in El Salvador. And there are certainly some frameworks that are not relevant. And what I do is I interpret what situations, artifacts, and events mean in light of the context that I've kind of raised here. So this is not really the structure of the talk, but this is to give you a sense of how I do what I do. Okay, so I want to note just three things. This is going to be roughly the organization of the talk. Three things to understand about Bitcoin's journey into El Salvador. The first, I'm going to start with a little discussion of Bitcoin's intellectual and cultural precedents in kind of like the tech community in the United States. I'm going to discuss the history of currency policy in El Salvador as a better sort of bit of context to frame any discussion of Bitcoin there, of what Bitcoin's sort of coming into. And then I'm going to sort of diverge and conclude with the political context of El Salvador under Bukele's rule. Okay, so on Twitter and in interviews, Bukele paints himself as simultaneously an everyman and as a tech-savvy innovator, along with his Nuevas Ideas or New Ideas party that now predominates in the legislature. El Salvador's president would bring the nation into the 21st century with innovative governance like introducing Bitcoin. However, his choice of timing, venue, and language through which he transmitted the announcement that El Salvador would now accept Bitcoin as legal tender speaks louder than words. He first broadcast his message in a pre-recorded English speech on June 5th, 2021, exclusively for audiences at Bitcoin 2021 in Miami, Florida. Oh, I'm repeating the dates. Anyway, The video cast ran concurrently with the El Salvador versus U.S. Virgin Islands soccer match, all of which suggest little regard for El Salvador's working poor and popular classes. And so I'm going to just play the clip of him making the announcement, and hopefully we can hear it.
My name is Nayib Bukele, and I'm president of El Salvador. Great ideas are beautiful and have great power. But like most beautiful things, they can also be more fragile than we think. When I was a kid, we thought about the future and we were delighted by its possibilities. We couldn't wait for it to happen and be part of its creation. But now, ask almost anyone what they think about the future, and they will say something along the lines of nuclear war, climate catastrophe, hunger, pestilence, the death of life. We didn't take care of the beautiful idea that we create our own future, that we as humanity can do almost anything that we imagine. Our ingenuity, what separates us from other species. In El Salvador, we are trying to rescue this idea and start the design of a country for the future, using the best ingredients that makes us who we are, while using sensibility to find the best examples of ideas from history and around the world. I believe Bitcoin could be one of these ideas. That is why next week, I will send to Congress a bill that will make Bitcoin a legal tender in El Salvador. In the short term, this will generate jobs and help provide financial inclusion to thousands outside the formal economy. And in the medium and long term, we hope that this small decision can help us push humanity and this economy deep into the right direction.
So clearly, Bitcoiners are in favor of this possibility, and so they sort of drown out his announcement a little bit here. But sort of, and there are little animations in here that I'm just gonna, okay. That I'm going to slide over because this is sort of what the PowerPoint gives you. Anyway, okay, but the government's neglect to take stock of popular opinion does more than reinforce Bukele's public self-portrait as a man of action and innovation. My concern is that it marks poor and working Salvadorans as guinea pigs, not protagonists in his macroeconomic financial experiment. According to the official rationale, Bitcoin's foray into El Salvador's economy might be thought of as, quote, a technical fix, introducing blockchain technologies to facilitate not only the frictionless flow of migrant remittances and foreign investment, but also financial inclusion for the nation's poor in a context of widespread underemployment and radical inequality. Casual observers, of course, might find themselves scratching their heads. How would the introduction of a digital currency alter what would appear the obstinate structures of Salvadoran society? Economist Steve Hanke, an American economist, for example, raised questions about how the United States' former Cold War enemies, namely China and Russia, might exploit the situation and unload their Bitcoin holdings on unwary Salvadorans. Given Hanke's previous membership in President Ronald Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors, it's not difficult to detect a barely concealed security agenda in his assertions that Bukele's decision was, quote, stupid, and that it might collapse El Salvador's economy. A point further underscored by the International Monetary Fund's November 22nd recommendation that in light of extensive risks to consumers and the nation's financial stability, Bitcoin should not be used as a legal tender. And that's me quoting directly from the document. Indeed, the new Bitcoin law, according to reporting at the Financial Times, has imperiled a proposed $1 billion IMF program with El Salvador to address the pandemic's aftermath. And yet, Bitcoin itself, to sort of transition to this intellectual history and cultural history I wanted to highlight here, Bitcoin itself may be thought of as the product of a previous crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, where the financial industry's speculative wagers on mortgage derivatives fundamentally destabilized the global economy. While many in the United States experienced economic shockwaves in the fallout, the federal government chose to prosecute only one banker for inflating the value of financial assets. So this is kind of one of the major grievances that people who assert the value of Bitcoin reach for. 6 weeks after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which is the event that kind of set off the financial crisis, the event thought to kicked off the financial crisis, the pseudonymous Satoshi Nakamoto introduced Bitcoin as a digital currency in a now legendary white paper. And here you have a wonderful Amazon-made poster of the entire white paper that you can hang up on your wall. Specifically, Nakamoto proposed that Bitcoin would involve direct peer-to-peer transactions, which could occur without the intermediation of a trusted third party, a bank or an app. Moreover, unlike the financial instruments whose collapse produced the crisis in the first place, such financial claims and counterclaims on a single asset presents little problem for Bitcoin, right? So one of the problems of the financial crisis is that so many people were wagering for and against these underlying assets that ended up being vacuous, that sort of the money chain, as a sort of the claims for money sort of all collapsed into one another, and it sort of made lending and debt impossible, for a moment anyway. The digital coin is reputedly an incorruptible form of currency, stored as cryptographic code in thumb drives and digital wallets. Bitcoin enthusiasts insist that the technological features like these all but guarantee Bitcoin's profound, quote, democratization of finance, threatening to disrupt concentrations of power by eliminating the intermediation of government and financial institutions. And yet, as scholar and journalist Nathan Schneider argues, Bitcoin's ideology of decentralization operates, quote, as a rhetorical strategy that directs attention towards some aspects of a proposed social order and away from others. Discourses of decentralization, he continues, tend to take on a tragic hue, and justly so. Even the most apparently decentralized systems have shown the capacity to produce economically and structurally centralized outcomes. End quote. The potential for mere rearrangement or fortification of existing forms of social power is one of the many reasons critics take issue with Bukele's Bitcoin law. Although promoters proclaim that Bitcoin will supplant all sovereign currency, questions remain about about Bitcoin's basic utility as money. So political economists for a long time have argued that money's usefulness is defined by three functions: as a medium for circulating commodities in the market, as a measure of value between different assets, right? So if you know, in the sort of barter imaginary the economists sort of try to reach for, it's like, 15 mangoes equals 1 mule or something, right? And so you're in doing that kind of exchange, you're sort of measuring the various values of different things, right? And that's what money's supposed to help us do. And finally, as a store of value, right? So that money itself is somewhere where we expect that the dollar that we put into the bank will be the same value that it was when we withdraw, or that it will be when we withdraw it the same amount as it was when we put it away. So understood within these constraints, Bitcoin's unreliable value in relation to other assets and currencies indicates that it cannot serve two of money's principal functions, namely as a store and measure of value. Data at CoinDesk, which is the sort of internet's hub for pricing of Bitcoin, indicates that at its peak in mid-April 2021, one Bitcoin traded for around $64,000, which is sort of the peak. And it dropped to around $31,000 in late July, an approximate decrease of 52%. As if to reflect Bitcoin's erratic value, financial analysts tend to categorize the digital currency amongst the most volatile asset classes. For example, the Wall Street Journal reports that 17% drop in the value of the Bitcoin inside a few minutes, just days after Bitcoin became legal tender. So there's this sort of intrinsic volatility that I think tends to be explained away by more eager enthusiasts in Bitcoin. What this means for working class Salvadorans with a bank account, who are only about 6% of the bottom 40%, is that any Bitcoin savings they might have had could lose half its value in a matter of months. Indeed, it takes little more than a tweet from Tesla founder Elon Musk to dramatically alter Bitcoin's value. Under these conditions, earlier plans to install Bitcoin ATMs have been set aside in the global north, as Bitcoins have increasingly become the province of high-risk financial traders. Quote, "A bet on Bitcoin is, in the words of the former president of Salvadoran Central Reserve, Carlos Acevedo, is like playing roulette in Las Vegas." Enter El Salvador's president and his New Ideas party to resolve Bitcoin's utility problem, and in the process kickstart El Salvador's flagging economy. With nearly 40% of urban workers experiencing underemployment and over half the urban population employed by the informal sector, there's little wonder why Bukele's drastic strategy might seem attractive. Should he succeed, it would represent Bitcoin's triumphant achievement of all of money's requisite functions and proof to the world that cryptocurrencies are the future of money. Swept up in Bukele's ambition, a supermajority of El Salvador's Legislative Assembly passed the Bitcoin law in a 5-hour session with little debate just 2 days after his speech. The resulting 3-page legislative document establishes that vendors and service providers must accept Bitcoin, save for those who lack the appropriate technology. Surprisingly, Article 5 seems to demarcate the new law's specific beneficiaries by granting capital gains tax exemptions for all Bitcoin winnings. Still, echoing the prevailing discourse that institutions should aim to bank the unbanked, Bukele insists in a tweet that, quote, "Bitcoin will bring financial inclusion, investment, tourism, innovation, and economic development in our country." But considering Salvadoran disparities in access to online spaces, because electricity is uncertain and so are cell phone usage, and therefore to necessary apps, there's good reason to doubt Bukele's vision of a Bitcoin capitalism that is on the one hand inclusive of the poor and on the other rapidly developing. Dramatic shifts in policy, and this is where I shift to the sort of history of currency policy in El Salvador. Dramatic shifts in currency policy are not unprecedented in Salvadoran history, even in recent memory. The New Ideas Party's haste to adopt Bitcoin outdid the 8-day legislative approval period for President Francisco Flores' declaration that El Salvador's economy would dollarize in 2001. Rather than consult with the broader public, Flores and his colleagues in the right-wing Arena Party preferred the counsel of US-educated economist Manuel Hines. He advised that because local currencies are rarely international currencies, El Salvador's colon, which was the sort of currency then, was somehow holding back the nation from globalization's beneficence. As his book on dollarization would later query, quote, "Why should you take a currency that mirrors the stability of the dollar if you can have the dollar?" While nations like Ecuador employed dollarization to stabilize economies after hyperinflation, El Salvador enjoyed a modest inflation rate prior to dollarization, which you'll recall is the sort of reason for both Bitcoin and the dollar to become El Salvador's currency. Even so, government justifications for dollarization included fighting inflation, expanding foreign investment, and decreasing costs on international transactions. Bitcoin boosters likewise stress its immunity from inflation, given the cap on the number of circulating Bitcoins, right? There's a sort of cap on how many Bitcoins can be out there, which is why those mining operations you hear about, where there's server farms that used to be in China but are now in the sort of former Soviet republics, et cetera, they have to get bigger because the cryptographic software requires that you have to put in more and more work to get sort of access to the currency. Anyway, we can talk about that in Q&A if it doesn't make sense. So in El Salvador, dollarization primarily served the interests of the new financial and industrial oligarchy. Sociologists Marcia Towers and Sylvia Borzutsky cite a University of Central America study that found It is in the financial sector's interest to dollarize so that if any opposing political party gains power, or if the financial sector otherwise loses its political influence, financial policy can barely be altered. 2 decades after dollarization, Tico Times reports that the banks and imports remain the most favored sectors of the economy despite promises of a national economic upturn. As a matter of fact, Salvadoran elites who pushed through dollarization cared little about the consequences for the poor. They viewed their own narrow economic interest as the national interest. However, the promised growth through foreign investment has yet to arrive, leaving the Salvadoran economy vulnerable and without monetary tools to manage economic shocks. So one of the tools that people use for monetary policy is to pursue a certain kind of inflation to sort of reduce demands for funds. Ironically, poor Salvadorans were the ones who experienced inflated prices on everyday consumables. After dollarization, vendors rounded up prices to manage the unevenness of 8.75 colones to $1 exchange rate. When compared to the European Union, which spent 3 years educating Europeans how to use euros, Towers and Berzutsky claimed that the Salvadoran government did little to educate the public about conversion rates. As their interviews reveal, many Salvadorans depended on conversion tables published in newspapers and calculators, leaving the 21% of Salvadorans who are literate out of the sort of conversion process, and therefore vulnerable to those who know. The political class's dollarization communicated no interest in the ramifications of such a shift would have for the lives of working and impoverished Salvadorans. Of course, just as important is Bitcoin enthusiasts share a fundamental misrecognition of Salvadorans' actual lived conditions of poverty. Mike Peterson, an Anglo-Bitcoin promoter in El Salvador, insists that Bitcoin in Salvadoran hands will empower them to feel like investors to design their future more. While the notion that we might design ourselves out of inequality seems to have gained steam of late, Peterson's comment would appear to clash with the reality that approximately 1/3 of Salvadorans sit below the poverty line, where in designing a future, let alone surviving it, are prospects with dodgy odds. In recent conversations about Salvadoran government's new policies via Twitter, I regularly encounter Bitcoiners' description of an imagined hoard of money stuffed between poor Salvadorans' mattresses, i.e. potential capital waiting to be invested in the free market. Fictions such as these say more about Bitcoiners' distrust of banks and institutions than they do about why El Salvador's economy is not flourishing. And one of the things that that come from the sociologists that I'm citing here, one of the things that comes across in their studies is that unlike maybe some of us who go to the grocery store once a week and spend I don't know, we drop $50, $100 on our groceries. I do because I'm a big eater. Salvadorans go to the grocery every day and they'll get like a cup of beans. So there's multiple opportunities per day to encounter a kind of exploitative conversion process here. In truth, hoarded capital at the grassroots may not be the only reasons that remittances sent from abroad make up 1/5 of the annual gross domestic product of El Salvador. More specifically, thousands of micro-businesses eke out an existence in El Salvador's massive informal market. Such businesses rarely provide owners with the minimum wage and rarely grow beyond basic subsistence, right? So they're not turning a profit. They're basically just sort of maintaining themselves. For businesses run at this scale, small economic shocks bear their catastrophic potential. They may propel those at the lowest quintile of the economy deeper into poverty. Moreover, despite Bitcoin enthusiasts' claim to the contrary, remittance senders in the United States are trading processing fees from Western Union and other intermediaries for significant foreign exchange rates because they will no longer be sending dollars into a dollarized economy. So, most of Salvadorans who immigrate to the United States. I think Los Angeles has as many Salvadorans as much of the nation of El Salvador, and DC as well. By contrast, Bitcoin boosters tend to imagine that the biggest obstacle to cryptocurrency normalization in El Salvador is education of ordinary citizens. This effort began in earnest before the government took up the digital currency, with Hope House, a Christian missionary nonprofit in El Zonte, Chiltihuapan department of El Salvador. There, Hope House implemented a cryptocurrency scheme entitled Bitcoin Beach, which you may have heard of a little bit more recently, that's been making its round on the podcasts, in which missionaries offered aid first to local youths and later upwards of 500 pandemic-affected families, which was conditional on aid recipients accepting payments in Bitcoin. As Mike Peterson explains in the podcast about the Bitcoin Beach project, quote, "I think that it's important that people realize they don't have to understand everything about Bitcoin. They don't have to sell them on all aspects of it. What we really need to do is get them using it. Once they start using it, they have that aha moment." Here, Peterson indicates the debate over Bitcoin will be settled not by discussing its possible merits, but when people experience its uses. To be sure, the currency's existential volatility would be a hard sell, but Peterson's comment also echoes Bukele's failure to educate Salvadorans about Bitcoin. In a sense, they both suggest that Salvadorans cannot grasp the value of what's right in front of them. Misgiving about others' motives are built into Bitcoin technology. And I apologize here, I kind of went on a slide sort of. I sort of spent all my slides in the first ones, and now I have much fewer slides, so I apologize. I kind of ran out of time here. But misgivings about others' motives are built into Bitcoin's technology, and here is sort of continuing on this sort of question of Bitcoin's history. Quote, "It is a techno-utopia," Nigel Dodd claims, "that rests quite literally on a technology of mistrust. Blockchain, the database type upon which Bitcoin relies, depends on the distributed storage of a ledger on which all transactions are recorded pseudonymously. No single machine controls the ledger, but instead so-called Bitcoin miners validate each transaction and add it to the public ledger. Similarly, one's Bitcoins are not held in an institution or machine, but in virtual wallets and thumb drives. Unsurprisingly, ransomware hackers prefer the anonymity of Bitcoin transactions to receive payments from captive governments and companies. As David Galumbia persuasively argues, Bitcoin users' resolve to decentralize money comes from a decades-old right-wing conspiracy about the US Federal Reserve and its power to print money. He traces the origins of this conspiracy theory to the anti-communist John Birch Society that saw the Fed as frittering away the real value of money to the benefit of a shadowy, wealthy cabal, and here you should read wealthy Jews as in the Rothschilds. Such conspiracy theories run rampant today amongst the radical right wing, as in Alex Jones of InfoWars, but also in the cyber-libertarian circles that ostensibly birthed Bitcoin. This unexpected solidarity between rightists and the internet's ostensible freedom fighters comes as no surprise to Galumbia, who points to their prevailing free market fundamentalism. In other words, despite Bitcoiners' zealotry about democratizing finance, for them, the greatest freedom imaginable is the right to accumulate in an unregulated environment. So where does the balance sheet stand for Bitcoin's success in El Salvador? A University of Central America poll conducted in September indicates that almost 70% of Salvadorans strongly oppose the adoption of Bitcoin as legal tender. And here I'll cite a more recent survey taken by the commercial and industrial sort of cabinet in El Salvador. So this is a government institution that shows that 86% of people have not made any transactions in Bitcoin at all, and only 3.6% have seen their sales increase with the adoption of Bitcoin. So there's a kind of perhaps a murky or darker picture here for Bitcoin's future in El Salvador. Moreover, thousands mobilized in the streets of San Salvador on October 17th to voice their opposition to the currency law, and the New Ideas parties swing towards authoritarianism, which I'll talk about here in a moment. These anti-regime and anti-Bitcoin demonstrations repeated once again on December 12th. Similarly, bond markets held an unofficial referendum on El Salvador's new currency as government bonds dropped significantly in mid-September. Investors also took a dim view of Bukele's most recent charter city scheme, which he hoped would be supported by Bitcoin-backed securities. Siobhan Mordern, a strategist at Amherst Pierpoint Securities, questioned, how is El Salvador going to attract Bitcoin-related foreign direct investment inflows when the autocratic policy risk is typically a deterrent? And so as Bukele and his party sort of shift toward a kind of authoritarian politics, that's deemed to be a kind of financial risk because, even though authoritarians can maintain order and maintain the value of things, they can also be quite capricious and have the power to make decisions that alter the situation on the ground pretty quickly and radically, right? The UCA poll also revealed that broadly, Salvadorans believe Bitcoin winners to be fixed from the beginning, namely wealthy foreign investors, government officials, and business leaders. Bitcoin's wealth may already be concentrated amongst this faction. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, those owning over 1,000 Bitcoins controlled approximately half of all Bitcoins in circulation. The NBER also found that the top 10% of Bitcoin miners control 90% of Bitcoin mining capacity. These so-called whale owners need marginal buyers to maintain or increase the value of their holdings. Sociologist Nigel Dodd observes that for all of Bitcoiners' quasi-anarchist rhetoric, quote, the argument for its horizontalism is undermined by the way the system operates in practice, because it incentivizes the most powerful producers of the currency to become even more powerful. This imbalance may be why Black Swan author Nassim Nicholas Taleb compares Bitcoin to a Ponzi scheme. And The Black Swan is one of these famous books that's thought to have explained the financial crisis of 2008. In 1920, Charles Ponzi, for whom this term was coined, offered investors unsustainably high returns for their investments, money which was primarily transferred from new deposits. In other words, those who stand to make the most money in a Ponzi scheme are those who were the first to invest. Although the Ponzi scheme analogy may be imperfectly capture the range of interests arrayed within El Salvador's transition, it nevertheless highlights how, as with dollarization, the poor have the most to lose. Rather than a revolutionary financial enfranchisement of the masses, Bitcoin represents instead business as usual for most Salvadorans. A recent study of unregulated cryptocurrency exchanges further cements this sense of outcomes, and this one comes from Cornell. Researchers calculated that on such exchanges where 90% of transactions occur, so these unregulated exchanges, 77% of trades on average constituted wash trades, or, quote, the simultaneous selling and buying of the same financial assets to create an artificial activity in the marketplace, which is known to distort price, volume, and volatility. Under current US law, wash trades are illegal in the case of non-crypto financial assets. In other words, for most crypto traders, volatility is the point, not a bug in the system. So, and I'll just give you this sort of anecdotal comment for what it's worth. I have a friend who is sort of like an early crypto adopter, and he spends a bunch of his day just kind of trading in and out and doing these sort of kind of wash trades of crypto every day to sort of cash in on, microscopic gains in the currency. In September, Bukele offered $30 of Bitcoin to Salvadorans to incentivize making the switch. But it takes a particular kind of cruelty to dangle Bitcoin stimulus before a population ravaged by pandemic-induced economic crisis. As technophilic elites rush to plunge their nation into the future, the hollowness of Bitcoin's promise for proletarian Salvadorans becomes increasingly clear. Bukele and company's accelerated push for new currency evinces an ambition to leverage the populace so that the elite can access the advantages of the stateless bourgeoisie. Thus, the technical fix may be in part a pretext for the accumulation of capital and influence amongst Salvadoran elites. Consider the package of government policies meant to facilitate accumulation via Bitcoin, a proposed tax-free charter city, which a charter city is a city built from the ground up, and the idea is that the laws would be sort of made as the city is built, particularly by business owners and entrepreneurs. Another of these policies include new measures to exempt Bitcoin investors from capital gains taxes, and efforts to privatize the nation's water sources, just as Bitcoin mining consumes an extraordinary amount of water. As scholars like Jorge Cuellar argue, although Bukele and his New Ideas parties hope to sweep away the Cold War's atrophied ideologies with measures like the Bitcoin law, they have yet to supersede its corrupt patterns. And here's a tweet where, I'm not sure how serious this is, but certainly suggests something about Bukele's sort of attitude toward everyday Salvadorans sort of working for a paycheck. But more than this, just recently, 2 weekends ago, there were 89 people killed in El Salvador within a matter of 48 hours by gangs, which are also a major problem in El Salvador. It's been revealed by reporting at a newspaper that I particularly like from El Salvador. It's called El Faro. They suggest that actually there were secret negotiations with gangs to reduce the number of homicides in the streets in order to kind of make Bukele's policies seem to work. So there were financial incentives given to gangs, and people who were imprisoned, who were the major sort of gang leadership, were given access to cell phones and sex workers and also financial incentives. So there's this revelation here, and amidst the state's denial, and Bukele is actually, in reaction to the killings, has launched a state of exception for 30 days, which suspends the right of association, the right to legal defense, increases the duration of detention without cause from 72 hours to 15 days. It restricts movement in gang territories. Pretty much no one can leave their house in these territories. If you go to his Twitter feed, you're going to see this sort of litany and photographic litany of all the different gang members they've arrested, supposedly, and many of them with tattoos, because that's sort of a thing that gangs do there. The gangs are actually through these killings, sending a message that they are in charge, and Bukele sort of, in an effort to sort of quell this, is actually turning toward a more authoritarian rule of the nation overall, right? A more consolidated approach to power. And I think this is really concerning in a context where decisions are being made simultaneously about currency decisions and also about sort of just Salvadorans' everyday rights. So I'm just going to leave it there. And I think that leaves some time for questions and comments.
Do you want a few remarks?
Yeah, sure.
Great. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Vázquez. And we now move to the question and answer portion of our program. Excuse me. For those who are present, please raise your hand and the microphone will be brought to you to ask your question. For those of you watching online, you can text your questions to 319-600-2588. That's 319-600-2588. While we're waiting for questions to come in, ICFRC wants to thank all of its members and donors for their support. If you'd like to join ICFRC or make a gift to support our programs, please go to icfrc.org. Thank you. So we'll start taking some questions now. Dave? Do you have the microphone, Catherine? Is that how we do it? We're getting our pieces together.
There we go.
If you want to come back to the front with the
Sure,
microphone.
here I go.
Thanks.
So thanks for your presentation. I don't know much about El Salvadoran history or recent history. Could you talk a little bit more about Bukele and how he came to power, and is he in for so many years, or what's his story?
So to consolidate a ton of history into like a very short period of time, since the mid-19th century, El Salvador has struggled with a kind of land-based oligarchy and intense military power, essentially a kind of deeply developed military state in a nation of like a single product economy, basically lording power over most Salvadorans, right? And so there's been significant struggles in 1932, in the 1950s, in the 1980s, to sort of unseat the kind of military authoritarianism that works in line with a kind of landed oligarchy. And so what happened in the 2000s was former leftist guerrillas formed a political party. They took over power, and Bukele was actually originally part of that party, the FMLN, the Faribundo Martí National Liberation Front. But he started to develop his own party. The New Ideas Party is to a degree his invention. And so, people were really excited about him, partly because he's sort of like this millennial president, right? He's like in his 40s. He's charismatic. He seems to be a kind of visionary of sorts for a number of people. And unfortunately, as he's sort of been trying to kind of secure power, he's gained a kind of quote unquote supermajority in El Salvador, which is to say the New Ideas Party, a brand new party, kind of developed the ability to kind of take over. And because people are excited, right? He's actually a popular president despite all the things I said. And despite the fact that people aren't really using Bitcoin there. Yeah, his essentially the ways in which he's been offering a means to sort of consolidate power is increasing with every sort of year that his administration is in power. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. If I heard you correctly, you said that there will not be capital gains taxes on gains denominated in Bitcoin. So wow, that's giving up a lot of higher end tax money. So I assume that is also going to translate into some other way to make up the revenue shortfall, which would be more regressive, possibly. Mm-hmm. So am I understanding that correctly? Is that also a kind of a feature of this transition that's likely to hurt the poor?
Yes, that is. And it's probably what's more complicated about that is like education is one of the sectors of Salvadoran society that takes the biggest hits, at least in the last 50 years or so. So that's like one place where those gains could be remade, unfortunately. But also Bukele has this sense that he wants people to immigrate to El Salvador because it is. So there are incentives for people who have a good deal of Bitcoin to come, and they'll be granted automatic citizenship. So there's this sort of wish for a kind of the kind of like techno utopia that's sort of imagined by a lot of newer tech enthusiasts, and one that is to a degree governed by these people because they know how to make money, and therefore that means they know how to manage every other institution that humans have. Yeah.
I've got a logistical question.
Yeah.
So we have, I'm over here. We have a new digital currency as the official currency of El Salvador, but it's not very popular with lots of people. There was no education. What are people paying in for goods and services?
So it hasn't replaced the dollar. The dollar is still, dollar-based denominations are still the ways that most people are exchanging things. And I think the hope is with something like Bitcoin is that it'll go viral, right? Like many things on the internet where things get exciting and people trade things. Like the thought is a kind of technological determinism kind of takes over, and this thought is that like people will be so excited about having a digital currency that they will just immediately switch and be like, oh, I can use my cell phone or whatever, right? And I think that was mislaid in El Salvador. So people, everyday folks are really just kind of still trading in dollars. And that's what they know. And and if they don't, even if they are educated, many people just sort of distrust Bitcoin as a medium of exchange because they don't know how to use it well. They don't, I think learning a new currency for anyone who's traveled abroad, it's like sort of like, when you go to Mexico, for example, 1,000 pesos is a certain amount, and 50,000 is suddenly like $1,000 or something, right? So like you're not really you're not able to judge and scale appropriately without something like a calculator, without really pausing. So I think there's just some significant mistrust, despite the fact that Bukele has is very popular.
The first slide that you had up indicated that Russia might be able to overcome the sanctions using Bitcoin. Can you explain that?
Well, Bitcoin isn't traded. Usually the way that states intervene on financial transactions is by contacting banks and essentially threatening them by either withholding bonds or declaring their actions in supporting a rogue regime to be illegal. And so when you get rid of those intermediaries, and instead you have this sort of this exchange that occurs virtually and there's no centralized hub to really interfere with that, what ends up happening is you have the ability to make these exchanges fairly quickly without anyone really understanding what's going on, and you have these kind of pseudonymous ways in which that's registered. So, there's no one responsible for Bitcoin, no one individual, right? It's distributed, and so as a result, like you can have people with other kinds of intentions when exchanging money to do so. I mean, this is why cryptocurrencies are popular on the dark web, right? Where some illegal things happen and are contracted. So this is sort of what this was one of the strategies that states use to kind of manage to work sanctions to manage others who are kind of departing from the norms of international society.
Hello. I have sort of a two-pronged question. Earlier on, you mentioned that the IMF decried El Salvador's adoption of Bitcoin as legal tender. What traditional interests would the IMF have? Do they have any history with El Salvador? And I'd also want to ask about mining and the sort of sovereignty that might lend El Salvador, because they're getting partially off of a dollar system by adopting Bitcoin.
Yeah. So the IMF and actually Bukele, up until the Bitcoin announcement, were pretty tight. Like there was an interest, and not to criticize the IMF, but I'm going to criticize like there are loans that are given. As somebody who studies Central America, there are loans that are given to people who are narco traffickers sometimes, who also have these sort of front businesses in palm oil, et cetera. So the IMF is not necessarily the most it doesn't always do its homework, but the idea that sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. The idea for the International Monetary Fund is because of the price volatility of Bitcoin, everyday consumers, whether they be at the level of a person exchanging 3 colones for for a cup of beans, or someone who's maybe in a more sophisticated financial position, that volatility would present a significant danger in a country where drastic economic changes can have ramifications that last generations. And so that's one of the things that's kind of complicated. And you're referring to one of the things that Bukele has also introduced is sort of using volcanic power to power these server farms as a kind of ecological remedy to the ways in which Bitcoin server farms have consumed. I think in total in the world, Bitcoin server farms consume on an annual basis about the same energy amount as Argentina, the nation of Argentina, consumes in a year. So Bukele was thinking, okay, let's shift it to volcanic power. I'm not sure if I understand the question about sovereignty. I don't know if it. I'm not sure what the state has to gain in that process, but maybe you know different.
Well, mining fundamentally.
Sorry, we're live, so.
That's okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. Mining fundamentally like secures the Bitcoin network, and the miner is rewarded in Bitcoin for doing so. So for perhaps that could be a source of revenue for El Salvador as a state, and maybe even could perhaps you know better than me, surely, offset some of the losses they might incur from lacking capital gains tax.
Yeah, I mean,
on Bitcoin.
Part of what's different about states than, let's say, our individual budgets is that states can run on massive deficits, and those deficits are judged in relationship to the financial position a state is in. So if the international community is not yet bought into, for whether or not we want to say that's sort of retrograde and not forward-thinking enough, or whether we want to say it's, too usefully cautious in the way that financial institutions sometimes are, maybe not in 2008, then the credit rating of the nation goes down. And that is something that has happened as a result of this transition. So that means that the nation can't borrow to build a dam or whatever, or to help invest in infrastructure. And so I'm not sure, I'm not someone who can sort of calculate those things, but there's at least some consequences that are harder to imagine. And states need consistent forms of funding, right? One of the reasons that sanctions are hurting Russia right now is that they can't pay their daily debts, right? Sometimes debt is exchanged over the long term, and sometimes debt's an overnight thing, right? And it's a means of sort of, trimming a little bit of earnings off the top of something, right? These overnight loans are another reason that that the 2008 financial crisis happened. And so, when those kinds of situations occur, there's not a lot of clawing yourself back necessarily. But again, I'm not able to calculate the sort of distinct difference between what's there to gain from these mining operations.
We now conclude our program. I want to give a big thank you to Dr. Eric Vázquez for his excellent presentation and for sharing his expertise with us today. Nice to hear human clapping. Eric, I am honored to present you with ICFRC's highly coveted mug for coffee, tea, or beverage of your choice. So come
Wonderful.
and make sure we
Let's
see it on the camera.
Should I hold up the mug?
Yes.
Yes, of course, right? Look at that.
All right.
Look
One more
at that
time.
mug.
Enjoy.
Thank you.